The mahogany walking stick my grandmother gave me wasn't just a mobility aid. It was my lifeline, my independence, my connection to a woman who taught me that strength comes in many forms. I never imagined it would become a weapon in someone else's hands, turned against me 6 separate times by the man I trusted most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But that Tuesday afternoon in October, as I watched Marcus Rivera swing my own walking stick toward my legs in a fit of rage, something inside me crystallized. This wasn't just about physical abuse anymore. This was about power, control, and the inheritance he'd been circling like a vulture for 3 years. The walking stick clattered against the hardwood floor of our shared apartment, the same sound that had echoed through my nightmares for months. Marcus stood over me, his chest heaving with anger, his eyes holding that familiar coldness that appeared whenever money was mentioned. My left leg throbbed where the carved wood had connected, adding another bruise to the collection I'd been hiding beneath long pants and careful positioning. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Claire?" He snarled, kicking the walking stick further away from my reach. "Acting like you're helpless when it suits you, then threatening to cut off my access to your precious family money when I need it most." I remained silent, having learned that arguing only made him angrier. Instead, I focused on the intricate Celtic knot pattern carved into the stick's handle, the same pattern my grandmother had traced with her fingers during our last conversation before she passed. She'd whispered secrets about our family's wealth that day, secrets Marcus would kill to know, secrets that were about to become my salvation. The story of how Marcus Rivera entered my life reads like a cautionary tale I should have recognized. 3 years ago, I was Claire Thompson, a 28-year-old graphic designer living in Cedar Falls, Oregon, trying to rebuild my life after a spinal injury left me dependent on a walking stick. The car accident that changed everything happened on a rainy November evening, leaving me with chronic pain and mobility issues that doctors said would be permanent. Most of my friends drifted away, uncomfortable with my new reality, but I was determined to prove that my worth wasn't measured by my ability to walk unaided. Marcus appeared at exactly the right moment, or so I thought. I met him at Golden Oak Rehabilitation Center during one of my physical therapy sessions. He was visiting his elderly uncle, or at least that's what he told me. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my recovery journey. Unlike others who either pitied me or ignored my disability entirely, Marcus treated me like I was still whole, still desirable. He had thick dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a smile that made me forget about the pain shooting through my spine. "You're remarkable," he'd said after our 3rd coffee date, reaching across the small table at Cedar Falls Cafe to touch my hand. "The way you handle everything with such grace. I've never met anyone stronger." His words were exactly what I needed to hear. For months, I'd felt diminished, less than the person I used to be. Marcus made me feel beautiful again, worthy of love despite my limitations. When he suggested we move in together after 6 months of dating, I said yes without hesitation. My modest downtown apartment became our shared space, and Marcus seamlessly integrated himself into every aspect of my life. The first time he used my walking stick against me was subtle. I'd been having a particularly difficult day, my pain levels spiking despite medication, and I'd asked him to help me reach something from a high shelf. Instead of helping, he grabbed my walking stick and deliberately placed it just out of my reach. "You're too dependent on this thing," he'd said with what I mistook for concern. "Maybe if you pushed yourself harder, you wouldn't need it so much." When I protested, explaining that my doctors had been clear about my limitations, Marcus's expression shifted. He picked up the walking stick and held it above his head, forcing me to hop awkwardly to try to retrieve it. The humiliation burned more than the physical discomfort, but when I started to cry, he immediately apologized, claiming he was just trying to motivate me to get stronger. The second incident happened 3 months later. We'd been arguing about finances, specifically about the money my grandmother had left me. I'd inherited a substantial trust fund, but access was limited until I turned 30, still 2 years away. Marcus had been pushing me to find ways to access the money early, claiming he had investment opportunities that couldn't wait. When I refused, citing the legal restrictions, he grew increasingly agitated. "You're being selfish," he'd shouted, his face flushed with anger. "Here I am, trying to build a future for us, and you won't even try to help." I'd been sitting on our couch, my walking stick resting against the armrest, when Marcus suddenly grabbed it and swung it toward the coffee table, deliberately knocking over my medication bottles. The pills scattered across the floor, some rolling, under furniture where I couldn't easily reach them. "Oops," he'd said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Looks like you'll need to work a little harder to get those." I spent the next hour crawling around our living room, gathering my scattered medication while Marcus watched television, occasionally stepping on pills I was trying to retrieve. When I finally confronted him about his behavior, he claimed it was an accident, that he'd simply been gesturing emphatically and hadn't meant to knock anything over. The pattern became clear over the following months, though I was still too emotionally invested to acknowledge it fully. Marcus had discovered that my walking stick wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of my vulnerability, and he could weaponize my dependence on it to maintain control. Each incident was carefully calculated to seem accidental or justified, but the message was always the same. I was powerless without his tolerance and support. The third time was during a dinner party at our apartment. I'd invited my best friend, Hannah Price, and a few colleagues from the design firm where I worked. Marcus had been drinking heavily, growing increasingly sullen as the conversation turned to travel plans and adventures none of us could afford. When Hannah mentioned a trip she was planning to Europe, Marcus made a snide comment about people who waste money on frivolous experiences. "Easy to be philosophical about money when you've never had to worry about it," he'd said, his eyes boring into mine. "Some of us understand the value of financial security." The tension in the room was palpable, but I tried to deflect with humor, making a light comment about how we all had different priorities. Marcus's response was swift and calculated. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and, accidentally, knocked my walking stick away from where I'd positioned it beside my chair. "Sorry," he'd said loudly, making sure everyone noticed. "Didn't see it there." But instead of simply picking it up, he stepped on it, preventing me from reaching it easily. I was trapped in my chair, unable to get up gracefully without my support, while our guests looked on with growing discomfort. Hannah immediately moved to help me, but Marcus waved her off. "Claire's fine," he'd said with that false charm he'd perfected. "She's stronger than she looks. Aren't you, sweetheart?" The humiliation of that moment, performed in front of people whose respect I valued, was devastating. Our guests left shortly after, and Hannah lingered, clearly wanting to say something about what she'd witnessed. But Marcus hovered nearby, making private conversation impossible. The fourth incident was the most frightening yet. I'd received a letter from Thompson Family Trust, the entity that managed my inheritance, requesting updated medical documentation for their files. The letter mentioned that my grandmother's will included specific provisions for beneficiaries with disabilities, including potential early access to funds under certain circumstances. I'd never known about these provisions, and the discovery filled me with hope and curiosity. Marcus found the letter before I could secure it safely. His reaction was immediate and violent. He'd been building a deck behind our apartment, a project that had consumed weeks and significant money we didn't have. When he burst through the back door, covered in sawdust and sweat, and saw me reading the letter, his expression darkened. "What's that?" he'd demanded, reaching for the document. I'd tried to explain, but Marcus wasn't interested in explanations. He was focused entirely on the phrase about early access to inheritance funds. His eyes lit up with a hunger I'd never seen before, transforming his familiar features into something predatory. "You've been holding out on me," he'd accused, his voice low and dangerous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All this time, you could have accessed that money, and you've been pretending you couldn't. When I protested that I'd had no knowledge of these provisions, that I was just learning about them myself, Marcus exploded. He grabbed my walking stick from where it leaned against the kitchen counter and swung it hard against the cabinet, the impact leaving a deep gouge in the wood. "Don't lie to me, Claire," he'd snarled, holding the stick like a baseball bat. "I'm not stupid. You've been playing games with me, keeping me dependent on your little charity payments while sitting on a fortune." The stick had connected with my shoulder that time, not hard enough to break anything but forceful enough to leave a bruise that lasted for weeks. Marcus had immediately apologized, claiming the swing was meant to hit the wall behind me, that I'd moved into its path unexpectedly. But I'd seen the calculation in his eyes, the careful measurement of force and angle. The fifth time happened, just 2 weeks later. I'd scheduled a meeting with Kevin Martinez, an attorney recommended by Thompson Family Trust, to discuss the early access provisions mentioned in their letter. I'd told Marcus about the appointment, hoping transparency would ease his growing suspicions and anger. Instead, it seemed to fuel them. "You're trying to cut me out," he'd accused the morning of my appointment, "going behind my back to lawyers, making plans that don't include me." I'd tried to reassure him that any financial decisions would be made together, that I valued his input and partnership. But Marcus was beyond reasoning. He'd been pacing our living room like a caged animal, his agitation growing with each minute that passed. When I'd risen from my chair to get ready for the appointment, reaching for my walking stick, Marcus had intercepted it. Instead of handing it to me, he'd held it just out of reach, forcing me to stand unsteadily. "Maybe you should reconsider this meeting," he'd suggested, his tone deceptively casual. "Maybe you should think about whether you really need outside advice for family matters." When I'd insisted that I was keeping the appointment, Marcus's facade cracked entirely. He'd swung the walking stick in a wide arc, deliberately striking my uninjured leg. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through my entire body, and I'd collapsed back into the chair, tears streaming down my face. "Accidents happen," he'd said, setting the walking stick down just far enough away that I couldn't reach it easily. "Maybe this is a sign that you should stay home today." I'd missed the appointment with Attorney Martinez, calling from our landline while Marcus showered to reschedule. But something had shifted inside me during those painful minutes on the floor. For the first time, I began to see Marcus's actions for what they truly were: systematic abuse designed to maintain his control over me and my financial resources. The sixth and final time Marcus used my walking stick against me was the moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 days after I'd secretly rescheduled my appointment with Attorney Martinez. I'd been careful to arrange the meeting during Marcus's work hours, taking precautions to ensure he wouldn't discover it beforehand. The appointment had been revelatory, providing information about my inheritance that I'd never imagined possible. Marcus came home early that day, claiming his construction site had been shut down due to rain. He'd seemed agitated from the moment he walked through the door, his usual greeting replaced by suspicious questioning about my day, my activities, my whereabouts. I'd tried to maintain normalcy, discussing dinner plans and weekend activities, but Marcus wasn't fooled. "You went somewhere today," he'd stated, not asked. "I called your office. They said you took a personal day." My heart had raced as I scrambled for an explanation that wouldn't trigger his anger. I'd mentioned a doctor's appointment, routine follow-up care that I hadn't thought worth mentioning, but Marcus had pressed for details, demanding to know which doctor, what time, why I hadn't told him beforehand. When my answers became inconsistent, contradicting information I'd given earlier, Marcus's suspicions crystallized into rage. He'd grabbed my walking stick with both hands, holding it like a weapon as he advanced toward me. "You're lying to me," he'd snarled, his face twisted with fury. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, probably talking to lawyers about how to keep me away from your money." His accuracy was so startling that I'd gasped, inadvertently confirming his suspicions. Marcus's response was immediate and brutal. He'd swung the walking stick with full force, connecting with my hip and sending me tumbling to the floor. As I'd lain there struggling to breathe through the pain, Marcus had stood over me with the stick raised again. "6 times, he'd said, his voice cold and calculating. "6 times I've had to teach you lessons about respect and honesty. Maybe the 7th time will finally get through to you." But as Marcus raised my grandmother's walking stick above his head, something profound happened inside me. Instead of fear or desperation, I felt a surge of clarity and determination that surprised us both. I thought about my grandmother, about the strength she'd shown throughout her life, about the legacy she'd left me that extended far beyond money. "There won't be a 7th time," I'd said quietly, my voice steady despite the pain. "Because after today, everything changes." Marcus had laughed, clearly thinking my words were empty bravado from someone pinned to the floor. He had no idea that my meeting with Attorney Martinez had revealed the true extent of my inheritance, or the power those revelations would give me. He had no idea that his 6 attacks with my walking stick had been carefully documented, photographed, and reported to authorities who were already building a case against him. Most importantly, Marcus had no idea that my grandmother's will contained provisions specifically designed to protect her disabled granddaughter from exactly this type of exploitation and abuse. As I lay on that hardwood floor watching Marcus grip my walking stick like a club, I realized that my grandmother had anticipated this moment and had given me the tools to fight back. The transformation began that afternoon as I lay on our apartment floor with my grandmother's walking stick just out of reach. But it wouldn't end there. Marcus Rivera had used my greatest vulnerability against me 6 times, systematically undermining my independence and self-worth, while positioning himself to exploit my inheritance. He'd calculated every move, measured every humiliation, believing that my disability made me powerless to resist his control. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been about everything, including the true nature of the inheritance he'd been so desperately trying to access. My grandmother hadn't just left me money. She'd left me weapons, and I was finally ready to use them. The afternoon sun streamed through our living room windows, casting long shadows across the floor where I lay, my walking stick several feet away where Marcus had thrown it after his latest attack. The pain in my hip was intense, but it was nothing compared to the burning determination that had taken hold of my thoughts. For 3 years, I'd allowed Marcus to convince me that my disability made me dependent on his goodwill and protection. For 6 separate incidents, I'd accepted his explanations and apologies, believing that love meant enduring his increasingly violent outbursts. But as I watched him pace our living room, muttering about respect and financial responsibility, I realized that every moment of this relationship had been carefully orchestrated to break down my resistance and independence. Marcus hadn't fallen in love with me despite my disability. He'd targeted me because of it, recognizing vulnerability he could exploit for his own gain. The meeting with Attorney Martinez 3 days earlier had opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never imagined. My grandmother's will wasn't just a simple inheritance distribution. It was a comprehensive protection plan designed by a woman who'd experienced her own share of manipulation and abuse throughout her long life. The provisions Kevin Martinez had explained were intricate and powerful, including clauses that could be activated in cases of domestic abuse, financial exploitation, or threats to my physical safety. "Your grandmother was remarkably prescient," Attorney Martinez had explained, spreading documents across his conference table. "She understood that wealth could make you a target, especially given your medical situation. Everything she left you comes with protections that can be weaponized, if necessary. Those words echoed in my mind as Marcus continued his tirade, still holding my walking stick like a threat. He had no idea that our entire apartment was about to be searched by investigators, that his financial records were already being scrutinized, or that his construction company was about to face scrutiny that would reveal irregularities he'd been hiding for years. The inheritance Marcus had been so desperate to access was worth far more than he'd imagined, but it came with strings attached that would strangle his plans entirely. My grandmother had been wise enough to include provisions that would transfer complete control to me in cases of domestic violence, while simultaneously exposing any romantic partners to criminal liability and civil penalties that could destroy their lives entirely. As I lay on that floor, listening to Marcus rant about my alleged deceptions and betrayals, I realized that his 6 attacks with my walking stick had given me everything I needed to activate those provisions. Each incident had been documented, through photographs I'd taken secretly, medical records from treatment I'd sought quietly, and testimony from witnesses like Hannah who'd seen enough to understand what was happening. Marcus had spent 3 years positioning himself to exploit my inheritance, but his own violence had handed me the keys to his destruction. The walking stick he'd used as a weapon against me 6 times was about to become the instrument of his downfall, and there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. The next morning, Marcus left for work with his usual kiss on my forehead and reminder to take it easy today. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had systematically brutalized me with my own mobility aid was now offering gentle advice about rest and recovery. I waited 30 minutes after his truck disappeared down Cedar Falls Boulevard before reaching for my phone to call Dr. Amanda Foster, the physician who had been treating my injuries without knowing their true cause. "I need to see you today," I told her receptionist, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "It's urgent, and I need to discuss some things about my recent injuries that I haven't been entirely honest about." Dr. Foster had been suspicious for months about the pattern of bruises and minor injuries I'd been presenting with, always accompanied by elaborate explanations about falls, clumsiness, and the challenges of navigating daily life with a walking stick. She was too professional to directly accuse me of lying, but I'd seen the concern in her eyes during our appointments, the careful way she documented each injury and asked probing questions about my home environment. The appointment was scheduled for 2 o'clock, giving me enough time to gather the evidence I'd been secretly collecting over the past year. Hidden in a small fireproof safe I'd purchased online and concealed behind winter coats in our bedroom closet were photographs of every bruise Marcus had inflicted, detailed written accounts of each incident with dates and circumstances, and copies of prescriptions Dr. Foster had written for pain medication following his attacks. The photographs were the most damning evidence. Using my phone's camera, I documented each bruise from multiple angles, capturing not just the physical damage, but the distinctive patterns that matched the carved details of my grandmother's walking stick. The Celtic knot design that had once brought me comfort was now permanently embedded in purple and yellow marks across my shoulders, legs, and back. I'd also been recording conversations with Marcus whenever possible, using a small digital recorder Hannah had given me for work meetings. The device had captured his threats, his admissions of deliberately placing my walking stick out of reach, and most importantly, his discussions about my inheritance and his plans for accessing it. The recordings painted a clear picture of financial abuse running parallel to the physical violence. Dr. Foster's office was located in Cedar Falls Medical Center, a modern facility that had become uncomfortably familiar over the past 3 years. As I sat in the waiting room, my walking stick resting against my chair, I thought about how many times I'd made this journey to seek treatment for injuries Marcus had inflicted. Each visit had been an opportunity to speak the truth, but fear and misplaced loyalty had kept me silent. "Claire, come in," Dr. Foster said when my name was called. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to be easily fooled. "You sounded upset on the phone. What's going on?" I followed her into the examination room where we'd had so many conversations about my mysterious injuries. This time would be different. This time, I would tell her everything. The bruises and injuries I've been coming to you about, I began, my voice gaining strength with each word. They're not from falls or accidents. My boyfriend has been hitting me with my walking stick, and I need you to help me document everything properly. Dr. Foster's expression shifted from professional concern to barely contained anger as I explained the pattern of abuse, showing her the photographs and playing portions of the recordings I'd collected. She examined each bruise with new understanding, taking detailed measurements and additional photographs for her medical records. "Claire, this is systematic torture," she said finally, her voice tight with emotion. "He's been using your disability against you, turning your mobility aid into a weapon. This isn't just domestic violence, it's disability-specific abuse, and there are enhanced penalties for this type of crime." She spent over an hour documenting everything, creating a comprehensive medical record that would serve as crucial evidence in any legal proceedings. More importantly, she connected me with resources I hadn't known existed, including a domestic violence advocate who specialized in cases involving disabled victims. "I'm going to give you the number for Patricia Valdez," Dr. Foster said, writing contact information on her prescription pad. "She works with the Cedar Falls Domestic Violence Prevention Coalition, and she's specifically trained in disability-related abuse cases. She can help you understand your legal options and connect you with additional support services." As I left Dr. Foster's office with my new medical documentation and resource information, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope backed by concrete action. For the first time since Marcus's attacks began, I had allies who understood the full scope of what was happening to me and were prepared to help me fight back. My next stop was Thompson Family Trust headquarters in downtown Cedar Falls, an imposing granite building that housed the legal and financial infrastructure my grandmother had built around her wealth. I'd called ahead to schedule an emergency meeting with Kevin Martinez, explaining that circumstances had changed dramatically since our previous conversation. The trust offices occupied the entire 15th floor of the Pinehurst Financial District's tallest building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Cascade Mountains. I'd only been here once before, for the initial inheritance briefing after my grandmother's death, and the opulence still took my breath away. Kevin Martinez greeted me in the reception area with the gravity the situation deserved. He was a man in his early 40s who had worked closely with my grandmother for over a decade, helping her craft the complex legal instruments that would protect her wealth and her heirs long after her death. "Claire, I'm glad you called," he said, leading me to a private conference room lined with law books and family portraits. "I've been reviewing your grandmother's will more carefully since our last conversation, and there are provisions I think you need to understand immediately." He spread several thick legal documents across the polished conference table, pointing to specific clauses that had been highlighted in yellow. "Your grandmother was very concerned about the possibility that you might face exploitation because of your disability. She included what we call nuclear options in your inheritance structure. The nuclear options were extraordinary. If I could demonstrate that I was being subjected to domestic violence, financial exploitation, or abuse related to my disability, the trust would immediately transfer complete control of all assets to me, bypassing the age restrictions that normally limited my access. More significantly, the trust would also initiate civil and criminal proceedings against my abuser, using its substantial legal resources to ensure maximum prosecution. The total value of your inheritance is approximately $8.7 million, Kevin said, watching my face carefully for my reaction. This includes property holdings, investment portfolios, and business interests your grandmother accumulated over her lifetime. Under normal circumstances, you wouldn't have full access until age 30, but the abuse provisions change everything. $8.7 million, The number was so large I had trouble processing it. Marcus had been circling around what he thought was a modest inheritance, maybe a few $100,000 that could fund his construction projects and lifestyle upgrades. He had no idea that he'd been systematically abusing someone whose wealth could purchase multiple construction companies without making a significant dent. "What do I need to do to activate these provisions?" I asked, my mind already racing ahead to the possibilities this opened up. Kevin pulled out a legal form titled Emergency Protection Activation Request and placed it in front of me. "You need to provide documentation of the abuse, which it sounds like you already have, and file a formal complaint with law enforcement. Once those steps are completed, the trust can act immediately." He explained that the trust's nuclear option wasn't just about protecting me. It was about sending a message to anyone who might prey on vulnerable heirs in the future. My grandmother had been determined that her wealth would be used as a weapon against abuse, not just a prize for abusers to claim. "There's one more thing," Kevin said, his expression growing even more serious. "The trust has been conducting background investigations on your romantic partners as a standard security measure. We have a file on Marcus Rivera that I think you should see." The file Kevin placed before me was thick and comprehensive, containing information about Marcus that I'd never suspected. Far from being the hardworking construction worker he'd presented himself as, Marcus had a history of targeting women with disabilities and elderly individuals with assets. His construction company was largely fraudulent, existing primarily to create the appearance of legitimate employment while he pursued what the investigators called romance fraud schemes. The file documented 3 previous relationships with disabled women, each following the same pattern: an initial period of charm and attention, followed by moving in together, then escalating financial demands accompanied by increasingly violent enforcement when victims resisted. In 2 cases, Marcus had successfully gained access to his victims' assets before they discovered his true nature. In the 3rd case, the woman had died under suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated. "Your grandmother's security team flagged Mr. Rivera as a potential threat within 6 months of your relationship beginning," Kevin explained. "They've been building this file ever since, hoping they wouldn't need to use it but preparing for the possibility that they would. The revelation that my grandmother had been protecting me even after her death was overwhelming. Through her trust and security measures, she'd been watching over me, documenting Marcus's crimes, and preparing the tools I would need to fight back when I was finally ready to use them." "What happens to Marcus when I activate these provisions?" I asked, studying the legal documents spread before me. Kevin's smile was cold and professional. "The trust will file civil suits against him for fraud, theft, domestic violence, and disability-related hate crimes. We'll also turn our criminal evidence over to federal authorities, since his pattern of behavior crosses state lines and involves financial crimes that fall under federal jurisdiction. Additionally, we'll freeze any assets he has and pursue recovery of funds he's obtained through fraudulent means." The scope of the legal assault my grandmother's trust could unleash was breathtaking. Marcus had spent 3 years positioning himself to exploit my inheritance, but he'd unknowingly been building his own destruction with every crime he committed against me. I left the trust offices with signed documents that would activate the nuclear options within 24 hours of my filing a police report about the domestic violence. Kevin Martinez assured me that investigators were already prepared to move against Marcus, waiting only for my official complaint to begin what he called total legal warfare against my abuser. The drive home took me past Golden Oak Rehabilitation Center, where I'd first met Marcus 3 years ago. I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my car for a few minutes, thinking about the woman I'd been then and the woman I was becoming now. The scared, isolated person who had been so grateful for Marcus's attention was gone, replaced by someone with the knowledge, resources, and determination to fight back against injustice. My phone buzzed with a text from Hannah, asking how I was, feeling after yesterday's fall. I'd been using household accidents to explain my injuries to friends and family, protecting Marcus's reputation even as he destroyed my body and spirit. That was about to change dramatically. I called Hannah back instead of texting, knowing I needed to start building my support network for what was coming next. Hannah, I need to tell you something important about what's really been happening with my injuries. Hannah listened in stunned silence as I explained the pattern of abuse, Marcus's manipulation of my disability, and the inheritance he'd been trying to access. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. I knew something was wrong, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. The way he treated you at that dinner party, how he always seemed to be controlling where you could go and what you could do. I should have said something sooner. I assured her that the blame belonged entirely with Marcus, not with friends, who had tried to support me within the constraints of what they understood about my situation. But moving forward, I would need her help in ways I was just beginning to understand. I'm going to the police station tomorrow morning to file formal charges, I told her. Would you be willing to come with me for support? Hannah didn't hesitate. Of course. What time do you want me to pick you up? As we made plans for the next day, I felt the isolation that had defined my relationship with Marcus beginning to crack. For 3 years, he'd worked to cut me off from friends and family, convincing me that my disability made me a burden they tolerated rather than a person they genuinely cared about. Hannah's immediate offer of support reminded me that Marcus's version of reality had been as false as everything else about him. That evening, Marcus came home in an unusually good mood, apparently believing that his latest attack had successfully intimidated me into compliance. He brought takeout from my favorite restaurant and suggested we watch a movie together, playing the role of the caring boyfriend with his customary skill. You seem better today, he observed, settling onto the couch beside me with his arm around my shoulders. More relaxed. I was worried yesterday might have been too stressful for you. The audacity of his concern for my stress levels, given that he was the sole source of that stress, might have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. Marcus was probing to see if his message had been received, if I understood that resistance would bring more pain and humiliation. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, I replied carefully, allowing him to believe his intimidation had worked. About being more honest with you, more considerate of your needs and concerns. Marcus's satisfaction was visible as he pulled me closer, his grip on my shoulder firm but not quite painful. I'm glad to hear that. I know I can seem demanding sometimes, but it's only because I want what's best for us, for our future together. I nodded and made appropriate responses to his plans for our shared future, all of which centered around gaining access to my inheritance and using it to fund his business expansion and lifestyle goals. Marcus talked about the house we would buy, the vacations we would take, and the investments he would make on our behalf, assuming that his violence had finally broken my resistance to his financial plans. What Marcus didn't know was that every word of his plans was being recorded by the small device hidden in my pocket, adding to the evidence that would be used against him in court. He also didn't know that investigators hired by my grandmother's trust had been monitoring his activities, documenting his fraudulent business practices, and building a comprehensive case that would destroy him financially and legally. As we sat, together on the couch, Marcus's arm around me while he planned our future with my money, I thought about my grandmother and the protections she'd built into my inheritance. She'd understood that wealth could make me a target, but she'd also given me the tools to fight back when that targeting became abusive. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into the Cedar Falls Police Department and activate the nuclear options that would turn my inheritance into a weapon against Marcus Rivera. His 6 attacks with my walking stick had given me everything I needed to destroy him completely, and there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. The irony was perfect. Marcus had spent 3 years positioning himself to exploit my vulnerability and access my inheritance. Instead, his own violence had handed me the keys to his destruction, and the inheritance he'd coveted would become the instrument of his downfall. As I sat there listening to his plans for spending money that would never be his, I smiled and nodded and played the role of the compliant victim he believed he'd created. But inside, I was counting down the hours until I could finally fight back with weapons he'd never imagined I possessed. The Cedar Falls Police Department occupied a modern brick building on Elm Street, its clean lines and professional appearance designed to inspire confidence in citizens seeking justice. As Hannah pulled her sedan into the visitor parking area, I gripped my walking stick tightly, drawing strength from the carved Celtic knots that had once been turned against me, but would now serve as evidence of Marcus's crimes. Detective Lisa Moreau was waiting for us in the lobby, a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs immediately. Kevin Martinez had called ahead to arrange the meeting, explaining that this wasn't just a routine domestic dispute, but a complex case involving financial fraud, disability-specific abuse, and federal crimes that cross state lines. "Ms. Thompson, I'm Detective Moreau," she said, extending her hand with professional warmth. "I understand you're ready to file formal charges against Marcus Rivera for domestic violence and related crimes." I nodded, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to set in motion. "I have extensive documentation of his attacks, including medical records, photographs, and audio recordings. I'm also prepared to provide information about his financial fraud and attempts to exploit my inheritance." Detective Moreau led us to a private interview room equipped with recording equipment and comfortable seating designed to put victims at ease. Hannah sat beside me for moral support, while Detective Moreau opened a thick file that already contained information about Marcus's criminal history and pattern of targeting vulnerable women. "Before we begin your formal statement, I want you to know that we've been aware of Mr. Rivera for some time," Detective Moreau explained. "He's been on our radar due to complaints from other victims, though none have previously been willing to pursue charges to completion. Your case could be the key to stopping his pattern of abuse permanently." The revelation that Marcus had other victims who had tried to seek justice was both validating and heartbreaking. I thought about the file Kevin Martinez had shown me, documenting Marcus's history of targeting disabled women and elderly individuals with assets. How many others had suffered in silence, too afraid or isolated to fight back against his systematic abuse? I spent the next 3 hours providing a detailed statement about each incident of violence, explaining how Marcus had weaponized my walking stick to maintain control over me while positioning himself to access my inheritance. Detective Moreau asked probing questions about the financial aspects of the abuse, taking careful notes about Marcus's demands for early access to trust funds and his plans for using my money to expand his fraudulent construction business. The photographs I'd secretly taken of my injuries were particularly damning evidence. Detective Moreau examined each image carefully, noting how the distinctive pattern of my walking stick's carved handle was visible in several bruises. The medical documentation from Dr. Foster provided professional confirmation of the abuse timeline, while the audio recordings captured Marcus's own admissions of deliberately using my mobility aid against me. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented domestic violence cases I've ever seen," Detective Moreau said as we reviewed the evidence together. "Your preparation and attention to detail are going to make prosecution much easier. Mr. Rivera won't be able to claim these were accidents or that you're exaggerating the severity of his actions." She explained that the charges against Marcus would include multiple felonies, aggravated domestic violence with a weapon, disability-related hate crimes, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud related to his attempts to access my inheritance. Additionally, federal authorities would likely pursue charges related to his pattern of interstate financial crimes targeting disabled women. "When we arrest Mr. Rivera, it's going to happen quickly and with significant force," Detective Moreau warned me. "Given his history of violence and the seriousness of these charges, we'll be treating him as a dangerous suspect. Are you prepared for the intensity of what comes next?" I thought about the 3 years of systematic abuse Marcus had inflicted on me, using my disability and mobility aid as tools of control while planning to steal my inheritance. I thought about the other women he'd victimized, and the one who had died under suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. The intensity of law enforcement response seemed entirely appropriate for someone who had caused so much suffering. "I'm ready," I told Detective Moreau. "Marcus has been escalating his violence, and I'm afraid of what he might do if he discovers I'm fighting back. The sooner he's arrested, the safer everyone will be." Detective Moreau nodded approvingly. "We'll coordinate with the trust investigators and federal authorities to arrest him simultaneously while executing search warrants on his residence, business, and vehicles. This will be a comprehensive operation designed to gather evidence and prevent him from destroying documents or fleeing." As we finalized the details of the arrest operation, I felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. For 3 years, Marcus had wielded absolute power over me through violence and intimidation. In less than 24 hours, that dynamic would be permanently reversed, with him facing the full weight of law enforcement and legal consequences for his crimes. Hannah drove me home in contemplative silence, both of us processing the gravity of what had just been set in motion. The quiet residential streets of Cedar Falls looked different somehow, as if I was seeing them through new eyes that understood justice was actually possible for victims of domestic violence. "Are you scared?" Hannah asked as we pulled into my apartment complex parking lot. I considered the question carefully. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "But I'm more terrified of what Marcus will do if I don't stop him now. He's been escalating, and I think he's capable of killing me if he feels cornered." Hannah squeezed my hand supportively. "You're doing the right thing. Marcus made his choices when he decided to hurt you. Now he has to face the consequences." Back in my apartment, I began implementing the safety plan Detective Moreau had recommended. I packed a bag with essential items and important documents, ready to leave immediately if Marcus became suspicious or violent. I also activated a personal safety app on my phone that would automatically contact police if I didn't check in at regular intervals. The waiting was the hardest part. Marcus would be arrested during the early morning hours, when he was most likely to be home and least likely to resist or flee. Until then, I had to maintain the appearance of normalcy while knowing that everything was about to change permanently. Marcus arrived home from work in his usual state of tired irritability, complaining about job site conditions and demanding that I massage his shoulders while he ate dinner. Playing the role of the compliant girlfriend required every ounce of acting ability I possessed, especially when he began discussing his latest plans for accessing my inheritance. "I've been thinking about that lawyer meeting you had last week," he said casually, though his eyes were watching my reaction carefully. "Maybe it's time I met with him myself, got a better understanding of what we're dealing with financially." The suggestion sent chills down my spine. Marcus was growing impatient with my supposed resistance to his financial plans and was considering more direct approaches to accessing my inheritance. If he managed to meet with Kevin Martinez, he might discover the true extent of my wealth and the protective provisions my grandmother had included in the trust. "I don't think that's necessary," I replied carefully. "The trust is very particular about only dealing with direct beneficiaries. Bringing in additional people might complicate things unnecessarily." Marcus's expression darkened at my gentle pushback, and I could see him calculating whether this was worth another violent lesson in compliance. "You know what I think, Claire? I think you're still trying to keep me out of important decisions that affect both of us. Maybe you need another reminder about how partnerships work." He stood up from the dinner table and walked deliberately toward where my walking stick rested against the kitchen counter. The sight of him approaching my mobility aid with obvious malicious intent triggered a panic response I had to fight to control. This could be the 7th time Marcus used my walking stick against me, but it would also be the last. "Marcus, please," I said, allowing genuine fear to show in my voice. I'm not trying to exclude you from anything. I just want to make sure we handle everything properly, so we don't jeopardize the inheritance." My apparent capitulation seemed to satisfy him, and he returned to his seat without grabbing the walking stick. "That's better. I know you understand how important this is for our future together. Once we get access to that money, everything will be different. We'll be able to live the life we deserve." As Marcus outlined his vision for our future funded by my inheritance, I nodded and smiled while mentally counting down the hours until his arrest. He had no idea that investigators were already positioned around our apartment complex, waiting for the signal to move in. He had no idea that search warrants had been prepared for every aspect of his life, or that federal agents were ready to seize his fraudulent business assets. Most importantly, Marcus had no idea that the inheritance he'd been coveting would be used to fund his prosecution and ensure that he faced the maximum possible consequences for his crimes. My grandmother's wealth would become the instrument of justice for not just me, but for every woman Marcus had victimized over the years. The evening passed with excruciating slowness as I maintained the pretense of normalcy while Marcus planned our future with money he would never touch. He fell asleep easily, apparently satisfied that his intimidation had successfully maintained control over me and my financial resources. I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing and waiting for the sound of police sirens that would end 3 years of systematic abuse. At 4:30 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Moreau. "Moving in now. Stay in bedroom until we give all clear." The sound of car doors slamming and heavy footsteps on the stairs was followed by pounding on our apartment door and shouted commands to open up immediately. Marcus jerked awake, confusion and panic evident on his face as he tried to process what was happening. "Cedar Falls Police, we have a warrant for the arrest of Marcus Rivera." Marcus bolted upright, his eyes wide with shock and growing fear. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, as if I somehow had answers about why police were at our door. At dawn, I remained silent, pulling a robe around myself while Marcus stumbled toward the front door in his boxers and t-shirt. Through the bedroom window, I could see multiple police vehicles in the parking lot, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the surrounding buildings. The arrest happened quickly and with overwhelming force. 6 officers entered our apartment when Marcus opened the door, immediately placing him in handcuffs while reading his rights. He was given only enough time to put on pants and shoes before being escorted to a waiting police car, his protests and demands for explanations falling on deaf ears. "Ma'am, are you Claire Thompson?" one of the officers asked, approaching me with professional courtesy. "Detective Moreau asked us to make sure you're safe and to escort you from the premises if you'd like." I nodded, gathering the bag I'd packed and following the officer out of the apartment I'd shared with Marcus for 3 years. As we walked past him sitting in the back of a police cruiser, our eyes met through the window. The shock and betrayal on his face was evident, but there was also something else. The dawning realization that he had seriously underestimated the woman he'd been systematically abusing. Detective Moreau approached me as Marcus's police car drove away toward the county jail. The arrest went smoothly, and we're executing search warrants on his business and storage units as we speak. You should know that federal agents are also involved now, and they're very interested in his pattern of targeting disabled women across multiple states. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond even what I had anticipated. Marcus's crimes weren't limited to his abuse of me, but were part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior that had victimized women across the Pacific Northwest. My courage in coming forward had opened the door to justice for multiple victims who had been too afraid or isolated to fight back on their own. Hannah arrived to pick me up within minutes of receiving my call, and I spent the rest of the morning at her house while law enforcement continued processing the crime scene and gathering evidence. The local news was already reporting on the arrest of a construction company owner on domestic violence and fraud charges, though they hadn't yet identified Marcus by name or provided details about the scope of the investigation. Kevin Martinez called around noon with updates from the trust's perspective. "The emergency protection provisions have been fully activated," he told me. "You now have complete control over your inheritance, and we're prepared to pursue civil action against Mr. Rivera for fraud and financial exploitation. The trust's investigators are also turning over their files to federal authorities." The transformation was complete. In less than 12 hours, I had gone from being Marcus Rivera's victim to being a woman with $8.7 million at my disposal and a team of investigators and attorneys ready to ensure he faced maximum consequences for his crimes. The walking stick he had used against me 6 times had become the key evidence that unlocked not just his arrest, but his complete destruction. As I sat in Hannah's living room, processing the magnitude of what had just happened, I thought about my grandmother and the protections she had built into my inheritance. She had anticipated this moment and had given me the tools I needed to fight back when I was finally ready to use them. Marcus had spent 3 years positioning himself to exploit my vulnerability and access my wealth, but his own violence had handed me the weapons I needed to destroy him completely. The inheritance he had coveted would now fund his prosecution, ensure maximum penalties for his crimes, and provide resources for other victims of domestic violence who lacked the financial means to seek justice. Marcus Rivera had used my walking stick against me 6 times, but I was about to use my inheritance against him in ways he could never have imagined possible. The war was just beginning, and for the first time in 3 years, I held all the advantages. Marcus's bail hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at the Cedar Falls County Courthouse, an imposing stone building that had witnessed decades of justice being served to those who preyed on the vulnerable. I arrived early with Kevin Martinez and Detective Moreau, prepared to face my abuser in court for the first time since his arrest 3 days earlier. The charges against Marcus had multiplied as investigators uncovered the full scope of his criminal enterprise. In addition to the domestic violence and disability-related hate crimes stemming from his attacks on me, federal prosecutors had added charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a criminal organization that targeted disabled women across multiple states. The evidence gathered from his apartment and business had revealed a sophisticated operation designed to identify, isolate, and exploit vulnerable victims. "The prosecution will be arguing for no bail," Kevin explained as we took our seats in the courtroom gallery. "Given the pattern of violence, the flight risk, and the federal charges, they want to keep him locked up until trial." Marcus was led into the courtroom in Orange County jail clothing, his hands and feet shackled, looking dramatically different from the confident construction worker who had terrorized me for 3 years. His hair was disheveled, his face pale, from days in custody, and his eyes darted nervously around the courtroom until they found me sitting in the front row. The hatred in his stare was palpable, a burning intensity that made clear he understood exactly who was responsible for his current predicament. But beneath the anger, I could see something else that gave me deep satisfaction: fear. For the first time in our relationship, Marcus Rivera was afraid of me and what I was capable of doing to him. His attorney, a tired-looking public defender, named Robert Hayes, had clearly been assigned to an impossible case. The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming, documented through photographs, medical records, audio recordings, and testimony from multiple victims who had finally found the courage to come forward. Hayes looked like a man preparing to argue for leniency rather than innocence. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the hearing to order with the gravity befitting such serious charges. She was a woman in her 60s known for her tough stance on domestic violence and her refusal to be swayed by manipulative defendants who tried to charm their way out of consequences. "Mr. Rivera, you are charged with aggravated domestic violence with a weapon, hate crimes based on disability status, financial fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud," Judge Hendricks read from the formal charges. "How do you plead?" Marcus stood unsteadily, his attorney supporting his elbow as if afraid he might collapse. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Caldwell rose to present the state's argument against bail. She was a formidable woman who specialized in complex domestic violence cases and had earned a reputation for securing maximum sentences against abusers who thought their charm could overcome evidence. Your Honor, the defendant represents an extreme danger to the community, and specifically to the victim in this case, Caldwell began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted hundreds of similar cases. Mr. Rivera engaged in a systematic campaign of violence against Ms. Thompson, using her own mobility aid as a weapon to maintain control over her and access her substantial inheritance. She outlined the evidence against Marcus with methodical precision, describing each incident where he had used my walking stick against me, and explaining how these attacks were part of a larger pattern of exploitation targeting disabled women. The audio recordings were particularly damning when played in open court, capturing Marcus's own admissions of deliberately weaponizing my disability against me. The defendant's criminal organization has victimized women across Oregon, Washington, and California, Caldwell continued. Federal investigators have identified at least 7 other victims, including one woman who died under suspicious circumstances that are now being reinvestigated as a possible homicide. The mention of a possible murder charge sent murmurs through the courtroom gallery. I had known from Kevin's files that one of Marcus's previous victims had died unexpectedly, but hearing it discussed as a potential homicide made the scope of his crimes even more terrifying. Defense attorney Hayes rose to argue for bail, but his heart clearly wasn't in the effort. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence and has strong ties to the community through his construction business. He's never been convicted of any crimes and poses no flight risk. Judge Hendricks looked skeptical as she reviewed the evidence presented by the prosecution. Mr. Hayes, your client is accused of systematically torturing a disabled woman with her own walking stick while attempting to defraud her of millions of dollars. The evidence includes recordings of him admitting to these crimes. On what basis should I believe he's not a danger to the community? Hayes had no good answer to that question, and his stammered response about presumption of innocence fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Judge Hendricks denied bail without hesitation, ordering Marcus to remain in custody until trial and imposing a no-contact order that prohibited him from communicating with me or any other victims in any way. Mr. Rivera, you will remain in the custody of the Cedar Falls County Sheriff until your trial date, Judge Hendricks announced. Any attempt to contact Ms. Thompson or any other victims will result in additional charges and enhanced penalties. As Marcus was led away in shackles, he turned to stare at me one final time. The fury in his eyes was mixed with something that looked like grudging respect, as if he was finally understanding that the woman he had systematically abused was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. I met his stare steadily, allowing him to see the strength and determination that would ensure he faced maximum consequences for every crime he had committed. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Caldwell approached me with updates about the expanding investigation. Ms. Thompson, I want you to know that your courage in coming forward has opened the door for other victims who were too afraid to speak out. We now have testimony from 6 additional women who were targeted by Mr. Rivera's operation. The additional victims ranged in age from 24 to 67, each targeted because of disabilities or vulnerabilities that Marcus's organization had identified and exploited. Some had been physically abused like me, while others had been subjected primarily to financial fraud and emotional manipulation. All had been isolated from support systems and convinced that no one would believe their accusations against a seemingly respectable businessman. The federal charges are particularly serious, Caldwell explained. Wire fraud and money laundering carry potential sentences of up to 20 years each, and the disability-related hate crime enhancements could add significant additional time. We're looking at the possibility of life in prison without parole. Life in prison. The word sent a thrill of satisfaction through me that I hadn't expected to feel. Marcus had spent 3 years convincing me that I was powerless, that my disability made me dependent on his tolerance and protection. Now he was facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars because of evidence I had gathered and crimes I had documented. Kevin Martinez joined our conversation with updates from the civil litigation front. The trust has filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Mr. Rivera seeking recovery of all funds he obtained through fraud, plus punitive damages for the pain and suffering he inflicted. We're also pursuing seizure of his business assets and personal property to ensure he can't hide money from his victims. The civil suit was running parallel to the criminal prosecution, ensuring that Marcus would face financial ruin even if he somehow managed to avoid the longest possible prison sentence. My grandmother's wealth was being used exactly as she had intended, as a weapon against those who would prey on vulnerable heirs. "There's something else you should know," Kevin continued, his expression growing more serious. "Our investigators discovered that Mr. Rivera had been planning to accelerate his timeline for accessing your inheritance. He had scheduled meetings with forgers who could have produced fake legal documents giving him power of attorney over your assets. The revelation that Marcus had been planning to completely steal my inheritance through forged documents was chilling. If I hadn't acted when I did, he might have succeeded in gaining legal control over my grandmother's wealth while leaving me powerless to stop him. The timing of my decision to fight back had quite literally saved my financial future." Over the following weeks, the investigation continued to expand as more victims came forward and federal agents uncovered additional evidence of Marcus's criminal enterprise. His construction company was revealed to be largely fraudulent, existing primarily to create a legitimate facade while he pursued romance fraud schemes targeting vulnerable women. The media attention was intense but generally sympathetic to the victims. Local television stations ran features about disability-related domestic violence, using my case as an example of how abusers weaponize mobility aids and medical conditions to maintain control over their victims. The coverage helped other victims recognize similar patterns in their own relationships and seek help from domestic violence resources. Hannah remained my closest support throughout this period, helping me navigate the emotional challenges of watching my private trauma become public evidence in a high-profile criminal case. "You're saving lives," she reminded me whenever I felt overwhelmed by the media attention. "Every story about your case might help another woman recognize what's happening to her and find the courage to fight back." Dr. Foster also played a crucial role in my recovery, helping me process the psychological impact of 3 years of systematic abuse while celebrating the strength I had shown in fighting back. "You've transformed from victim to survivor to advocate," she told me during one of our sessions. "Marcus thought your disability made you weak, but you've shown that survival can create the strongest possible foundation for fighting injustice." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Marcus's arrest, giving prosecutors time to organize the massive amount of evidence they had gathered and coordinate testimony from multiple victims. I would be the key witness, but I wouldn't be alone in telling my story of abuse and exploitation. As the hearing date approached, I found myself thinking often about my grandmother and the protections she had built into my inheritance. She had anticipated that wealth might make me a target and had given me the tools to fight back when that targeting became abusive. Her foresight had not only saved my life, but had created a mechanism for ensuring that predators like Marcus faced maximum consequences for their crimes. The inheritance Marcus had coveted for 3 years was now funding his prosecution and ensuring that he would spend decades in prison for his crimes. My grandmother's walking stick, which had become a weapon in his hands, was now key evidence that would destroy him completely. The irony was perfect. Every tool Marcus had used to maintain control over me had become an instrument of his own destruction. The night before the preliminary hearing, I sat in my new apartment holding my grandmother's walking stick and thinking about the journey from victim to victor. The carved Celtic knots that had once been pressed into my bruised skin were now symbols of strength and survival. Reminders that I had faced the worst Marcus could inflict and had emerged stronger than he could ever imagine. Marcus Rivera had used my walking stick against me 6 times, each attack designed to break my spirit and ensure my compliance with his demands. But his violence had given me everything I needed to activate the nuclear options in my inheritance and turn my grandmother's wealth into a weapon of justice. Tomorrow, I would face him in court one final time and watch as the legal system he had thought would protect him delivered the consequences he had earned through years of predatory behavior. The preliminary hearing would be my moment of complete triumph, the public vindication of every decision I had made to fight back against abuse and exploitation. Marcus had counted on my disability making me too weak and isolated to resist his control. Instead, my survival had made me strong enough to destroy him completely, and my inheritance had given me the resources to ensure he never hurt anyone again. Justice was coming for Marcus Rivera, delivered by the woman he had underestimated at every turn. The Cedar Falls County Courthouse was packed beyond capacity for Marcus Rivera's preliminary hearing, with spectators spilling into the hallway and local news crews positioned outside to capture what had become the most high-profile domestic violence case in the county's history. I walked through the crowd with my head held high, my grandmother's walking stick clicking confidently against the marble floor, as reporters called out questions and cameras flashed around me. Judge Patricia Hendricks had moved the proceedings to the largest courtroom in the building to accommodate the media attention and the numerous victims who had come forward to support the prosecution. As I took my seat in the front row, I could see Marcus at the defendant's table looking haggard and defeated, a stark contrast to the confident manipulator who had terrorized me for 3 years. The prosecution team, led by Sarah Caldwell and federal prosecutor Janet Mills, had assembled a case so comprehensive that legal experts were calling it a textbook example of how to prosecute complex domestic violence and financial fraud crimes. The evidence filled multiple boxes and included testimony from 8 victims, financial records spanning 5 years, and audio recordings that captured Marcus admitting to his crimes in his own voice. The people call Claire Thompson to the stand, Sarah Caldwell announced, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. I rose from my seat and walked slowly to the witness stand, my walking stick supporting each measured step. This was the moment I had been preparing for since the night I decided to fight back against Marcus's abuse. Every photograph I had taken, every recording I had made, every document I had preserved, had led to this confrontation where I would face my abuser in open court and expose his crimes to the world. Ms. Thompson, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. Caldwell began after I was sworn in. I looked directly at Marcus as I began my testimony, watching his face as I described our initial meeting at Golden Oak Rehabilitation Center and his systematic campaign to isolate me from friends and family while positioning himself to access my inheritance. His attorney had instructed him not to react, but I could see the anger building behind his carefully controlled expression. The defendant used my disability against me from the very beginning, I testified, my voice growing stronger with each sentence. He understood that my walking stick represented my independence and mobility, and he deliberately turned it into a weapon to maintain control over me. I described each of the 6 incidents where Marcus had used my walking stick against me, providing detailed accounts of his escalating violence and the calculated nature of his attacks. The courtroom was completely silent as I explained how he had weaponized my mobility aid while demanding access to my inheritance, using physical pain and humiliation to enforce his financial demands. Can you describe the impact of Mr. Rivera's abuse on your daily life? Caldwell asked, guiding me through testimony about the psychological toll of living with constant threats and violence. He wanted me to believe that my disability made me helpless, I replied, looking around the packed courtroom. He convinced me that no one would believe my accusations against a seemingly respectable businessman, and that my dependence on assistive devices made me an easy target who deserved whatever treatment he chose to inflict. The audio recordings were played for the court, filling the room with Marcus's voice, as he admitted to deliberately placing my walking stick out of reach and discussed his plans for accessing my inheritance. Several spectators gasped audibly when they heard him describe my disability as a convenient weakness that made me perfect for his purposes. Marcus's defense attorney, Robert Hayes, attempted to portray the incidents as accidents or misunderstandings, but the overwhelming evidence made his arguments sound desperate and unconvincing. When Hayes suggested that I had exaggerated the severity of the abuse to gain sympathy, Sarah Caldwell presented the medical records and photographs that documented every injury Marcus had inflicted. Your Honor, the evidence shows a clear pattern of escalating violence specifically targeting Ms. Thompson's disability, Caldwell argued. The defendant didn't just abuse Ms. Thompson, he tortured her using the very device she depended on for mobility and independence. Federal prosecutor Janet Mills presented evidence about Marcus's broader criminal enterprise, showing how his abuse of me was part of a systematic operation that had targeted disabled women across multiple states. The scope of his crimes was staggering, involving millions of dollars in fraudulent schemes and at least 9 confirmed victims who had suffered similar abuse. The defendant operated a sophisticated criminal organization designed to identify vulnerable women, gain their trust, and then exploit their disabilities and financial resources, Mills told the court. Ms. Thompson's courage in coming forward has exposed crimes that span years and multiple jurisdictions. As the testimony continued, I watched Marcus's composure gradually crumble. The confident manipulator who had convinced me I was powerless was now facing the reality that his victims had found their voices and were determined to see justice served. Every piece of evidence presented was another nail in the coffin of his defense, another step toward the lengthy prison sentence he had earned through years of predatory behavior. The testimony from other victims was particularly powerful. Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old teacher from Portland who walked with braces due to cerebral palsy, described how Marcus had hidden her mobility devices and forced her to crawl across her apartment to retrieve medication. Jennifer Walsh, a 41-year-old accountant from Sacramento, who was legally blind, testified about how Marcus had rearranged her furniture to cause falls and injuries while demanding access to her disability benefits. Each victim's story followed the same pattern: initial charm and attention, followed by systematic isolation, escalating violence targeting their specific disabilities, and increasingly desperate demands for access to their financial resources. Marcus had refined his techniques over years of practice, becoming more sophisticated in his manipulation and more brutal in his enforcement of compliance. This defendant is a predator of the worst kind, Sarah Caldwell summarized in her closing arguments. He specifically targeted women whose disabilities he believed would make them easy victims, women who might not be believed if they reported his crimes, women who could be isolated from support systems and terrorized into compliance. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Hendricks finding probable cause for all charges against Marcus and ordering him bound over for trial. More significantly, she granted the prosecution's request to add additional charges based on the testimony from other victims, including attempted murder in connection with the suspicious death of Marcus's former girlfriend in California. Mr. Rivera, you will remain in custody without bail pending trial, Judge Hendricks announced. The court finds that you pose an extreme danger to the community, and particularly to disabled women who might become your targets. As Marcus was led away in shackles, he turned to look at me one final time. The hatred in his eyes was still there, but it was overwhelmed by defeat and the dawning realization that his life as he had known it was over. I met his stare without flinching, allowing him to see the strength and determination that would ensure he spent the rest of his life paying for his crimes. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters and supporters who had followed the case closely. The media attention had sparked a national conversation about disability-related domestic violence and the ways predators exploit assistive devices and medical conditions to maintain control over their victims. Ms. Thompson, what would you say To other victims who might be afraid to come forward? A television reporter asked. I thought carefully about my response, knowing that my words might reach other women who were suffering in silence as I had for so long. Your disability doesn't make you weak, I said, looking directly into the camera. The people who exploit your vulnerability are the weak ones. You have more strength than they can ever understand, and there are resources available to help you fight back. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic after the overwhelming evidence presented at the preliminary hearing. Marcus's attorneys attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but Sarah Caldwell refused to accept anything less than the maximum possible sentence. The case went to trial 6 months later, resulting in convictions on all charges and a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The civil litigation was equally successful, with the court awarding me and the other victims substantial damages that were paid from the seizure of Marcus's assets and the recovery of funds he had stolen over the years. My grandmother's trust used its resources to establish a foundation supporting other victims of disability-related domestic violence, ensuring that Marcus's crimes would ultimately result in help for countless other survivors. The transformation, in my own life, was profound and ongoing. The inheritance that Marcus had tried to steal became the foundation for a new chapter focused on advocacy and justice for vulnerable populations. I sold the apartment we had shared and purchased a beautiful, accessible home in the hills overlooking Cedar Falls, complete with universal design features and a workshop where I could pursue the art therapy that had become central to my healing process. Dr. Foster continued to work with me as I processed the psychological impact of 3 years of systematic abuse and the empowerment that came from fighting back successfully. You've shown that survival can become the strongest possible foundation for helping others, she told me during one of our sessions. Marcus thought your disability made you an easy target, but your resilience has made you an unstoppable force for justice. Hannah remained my closest friend and strongest supporter, helping me navigate the challenges of sudden wealth and public attention while staying grounded in the relationships that truly mattered. You've changed so much since that first day you called me about the walking stick incidents, she observed during one of our weekly coffee dates. It's like watching someone discover they had superpowers all along. The foundation I established in my grandmother's memory became a powerful resource for victims of disability-related domestic violence, providing legal support, financial assistance, and advocacy services that had been unavailable when I was struggling to escape Marcus's abuse. The Foundation's first annual report documented assistance to over 200 survivors, with legal victories that resulted in lengthy prison sentences for dozens of predators who had targeted disabled victims. Kevin Martinez remained my trusted advisor, helping me use my inheritance strategically to maximize impact while ensuring my own financial security for the future. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud, he told me as we reviewed the Foundation's first-year accomplishments. She always said that wealth should be used as a weapon against injustice, and you've turned her vision into reality. The walking stick that Marcus had used against me 6 times became a symbol of transformation and empowerment, rather than vulnerability and victimization. I had it professionally restored by a craftsman who specialized in antique pieces, and it now sits in a place of honor in my home office where I can see the Celtic knots my grandmother had traced with her fingers during our last conversation. Sometimes I run my own fingers over those intricate patterns and think about the journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Marcus Rivera had tried to break my spirit by turning my mobility aid into a weapon against me, but his violence had ultimately given me everything I needed to destroy him completely and transform my inheritance into a force for justice. The irony was perfect and permanent. Marcus had spent 3 years positioning himself to exploit my vulnerability and access my wealth, but his own cruelty had handed me the tools to ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison, while my grandmother's money funded the prosecution of predators just like him. On quiet evenings in my new home, I often sit by the window overlooking Cedar Falls and reflect on the power of fighting back against injustice. Marcus had counted on my disability, making me too weak and isolated to resist his control, but my survival had made me strong enough to help other victims find their own voices and seek their own justice. The walking stick he had used against me 6 times had become the key to unlocking not just his arrest and conviction, but a broader movement to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation and abuse. My inheritance had become exactly what my grandmother intended: a weapon against those who would prey on the innocent, wielded by someone who understood both vulnerability and strength. Marcus Rivera would spend the rest of his life behind bars, while I would spend the rest of mine ensuring that his crimes led to justice for countless other survivors. He had used my walking stick against me, but I had used my inheritance against him in ways he could never have imagined possible. Justice had been served, and it was sweeter than I had ever dared to hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.